Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to a special Anti-Poverty Week edition of BSL Talks. BSL Talks is a series of webinars where we tackle some of the big issues in social policy, research and practice. My name's Zeah Behrend, my pronouns are she, her, and I have the privilege of being BSL's Chief Strategy and Impact Officer and facilitating today's BSL Talks. I have shoulder-length brown hair. I'm Caucasian with green eyes. Today I'm wearing a black blouse and gold earrings. I would like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners and custodians of all of the lands and waterways that you're joining from today. For me, in Fitzroy in Naarm, it's the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. Please feel free to put the country that you are joining from in the chat box. We're really looking forward to a lively discussion today. Before we get into it, I'm going to do some quick housekeeping. So closed captions are available by clicking the CC button on the bottom of your screen. Thank you to Zena, our captioner. Today we're joined by Ausland interpreters Alana and Megan, who you will see on your screen. If you have any questions during the session, please add them to the Q&A box, also found in the bar below on Zoom. Thank you to everyone who submitted some questions in advance. We'll aim to get through as many of these and the live questions through the discussion today. The discussion is also being recorded and will be made available on BSL's website over the coming weeks. If anything comes up for you during this discussion today, please visit our website www.bsl.org.au to find some helpful information on the services available to you. Ask Izzy is another platform that can help you find the right service for you. So hopefully, as you know from reading the invite to this event, this year marks the 50th anniversary since the Ronald Henderson Landmark Commission of Inquiry into Poverty in Australia and its final report. This was the most significant poverty of study in Australia. The inquiry shone a light on poverty and its measurement. It was described then as a significant and comprehensive account of poverty in Australia. For decades, the Henderson Poverty Line has helped researchers and policymakers gauge progress or lack of in tackling poverty in Australia. While the Henderson Poverty Line was an important development in its time, Australia has never adopted official poverty measures. The 50th anniversary of the report of the Henderson Inquiry is a great opportunity for Australia to become a leader on poverty measurement once more. Official poverty measures would make our economic compass more complete. The Economic Inclusion Advisory Committee, also known as EAC, has recommended that we adopt monetary and multidimensional poverty measures. It surprises many to hear that Australia does not have official poverty measures. 156 countries globally already do, either a monetary measure, a multidimensional measure, or both, which is best practice. Australia has neither. The failure to adopt official poverty measures makes Australia an international outlier and makes it more difficult to understand poverty, take action, and reduce it. It also makes it more difficult to mark and celebrate when progress is made. This special edition of BSL Talks is dedicated to the late Dr. Ian Manning, who is a highly respected economist and a BSL charter member since 1988. His expertise spanned local government, transport, environment, planning, and social security systems. Notably, he played a pivotal role in the Henderson Inquiry into Poverty during his time as a senior project officer at the Department of Social Security in Canberra from 1972 to 1975. BSL remembers his thoughtful contribution and commitment to social justice with deep respect and gratitude as we continue to advance a fair Australia. So it's my great pleasure now to introduce our four amazing panellists for the discussion today. First, I'd like to introduce Jo Evans. Jo lives in Seymour in regional Victoria, and in 2023, she participated in BSL's SEED project as she wanted to improve her employment prospects, make new connections, and build confidence. She sat on a family violence roundtable panel discussion, collaborated with local council to create family violence awareness flyers, and is about to start work as a facilitator for an empowerment program run by a local registered training organisation. Jo lives with her 2 grown-up children, one of whom lives with extreme mental health barriers. She holds 3 university degrees, a graduate diploma in psychology, a Bachelor of Psychological Sciences, and a Bachelor of Health Sciences. It's a pleasure to have you here, Jo. Thank you for joining us. Next, I'd love to introduce Tamara Rhodes. Tamara is from Broadford in regional Victoria. She encountered BSL also through the SEED project in Seymour, which helps build women's financial security, looking for connection and referrals to services and employment and education pathways. Since joining SEED, Tamara has now an additional focus, and that's to advocate for stronger support services for people living with mental health barriers. You may also recognise Tamara from some recent media coverage. Next, I would love to introduce Dr Melek Cigdem-Bayram, who is the Ronald Henderson Senior Research Fellow. This is a joint appointment between the Melbourne Institute and BSL. Melek is an applied economist who specialises in wealth inequality, intergenerational wealth transfers, poverty and disadvantage, housing and homelessness, and spatial analysis. Finally, I'd like to introduce Dr Nicole Bieske, our very own Director of Research, Policy and Advocacy at BSL. Nicole has had an extensive career in social policy, advocacy and research, with experience working across government, the community sector, academia, business, in housing, justice, international development and human rights. Nicole has a focus on systems change and how we influence those systems so they better meet the needs of people and communities. So thank you to a wonderful panel for joining us today as we explore measuring poverty and what that could look like in Australia and why. So first I'm going to go to Melek to start us off. So Melek, Australia still doesn't have official poverty measures, as I said in the opening, while other countries do. Why do we need official measures?
Thanks, Zeah. Yeah, the lack of an official poverty measure is problematic for several reasons. And the first of them is a really simple one. And it really comes down to the fact that what we measure ultimately shapes what we do as a nation and where we set our priorities. And it's why we measure things like unemployment, GDP, productivity, and so on. So if you can imagine a scenario where we didn't have consistent or reliable ways of measuring those things, not measuring unemployment, we'd have no clear picture of how the economy was performing, and as a result, governments couldn't track progress or take targeted action to improve it. And so that's exactly the situation we're in currently with respect to poverty. So the poverty rates that were recently reported by ACOS this week show just how little progress we've made on poverty. And so their figures show that in 2023, around 14.2% of Australians were living in poverty, and that equates to about 1 in 7 people. That's higher than what it was 15 years ago. It's even higher than what it was during the pandemic. And so I think it's fair to say that we've reached entrenched levels of poverty. And most worrying of all is that those rates are even higher among children. I think they reported that it was about 18% for children. Well, it's about 14% for the national population. So that's a real worry. And another problem is that because we don't have an official poverty measure, we're also not all using the same definition. And so that means that the numbers that are reported in the academic literature and the grey literature don't always line up. So in Australia, we've traditionally used income-based measures, but even their different methods can produce different results. So for example, some might use total income before setting the poverty line. Others might first deduct housing costs from income and then set the poverty line. Some might use equivalised income to take into account the size of the household and the composition of the household, how many are adults versus how many are children, and so on. Others might not do that at all. And while these might sound like small technical details, they do lead to different results, and these can really matter. And the issue of measurement isn't a problem that's unique to poverty. So Andrew Lee, who's the Assistant Minister for Productivity, highlighted this issue of measurement in a recent piece that he wrote, published in the Australian Economic Review last month. And he talks about how part of the slowdown in productivity is really about measurement, especially in sectors like health, education, where those traditional input-output metrics miss some of the improvements in quality. And so when we don't capture those quality gains, we can end up underestimating progress in those areas. And the same goes with poverty. So without an official and comprehensive measure of poverty, we don't really have a clear picture of how many people are struggling, or how that incidence is changing over time. And if we don't have reliable estimates, then governments aren't prompted to act.
Thanks.
And the lack of official poverty measures also have implications on a international scale, rather, in that we have international commitments in the form of our Sustainable Development Goals. So Australia was a signatory of the SDGs since 2015. And the first of those goals is focused entirely on poverty. So to firstly halve poverty rates by 2030, but secondly also to reduce poverty in all its forms and dimensions everywhere. And in terms of the first of those goals, Australia's performance has actually worsened since it became a signatory of the SDGs. And we don't know how we're performing on the second poverty goal. So we don't have an official measure of multidimensional poverty. We don't have an unofficial measure, so we don't know how we're tracking. And so that makes us an international outlier, as you mentioned, Zeah. So there are over 80 countries, including countries that are comparable to us, Ireland, Canada, New Zealand, many across Europe who measure poverty multidimensionally and who measure it officially. There are over 160 countries that measure either monetary or multidimensional poverty or both. And so what this essentially means is that while most countries can track their progress, their own national progress against the SDGs and hold themselves to account, Australia can't currently do that. And because we don't have an agreed benchmark. And so without one, we're essentially working in the dark.
Great. Thanks, Melek. So a lot of people will have heard of the Henderson Poverty Line, but I think less people will have heard of multidimensional poverty measures. Would you be able to talk us through what is a multidimensional poverty measure or a multidimensional poverty index known as an MPI and what that could look like in Australia?
Sure, yeah. So the Multidimensional Poverty Index, known as the MPI, was developed by Sabina Al-Kaya and James Foster back in 2011. And underpinning the conceptual framework of the model is Amartya Sen's capability approach, which really shifts the focus away from what people have, so the economic resources they have, to assessing whether they have the freedoms and the opportunities to live the kind of life that they aspire to, or the kind of life that they value. In an Australian context, it's, well, to the extent to which they achieve the kind of living standards that most Australians might take for granted. And the MPI does this by firstly identifying a set of key dimensions, so things like health, education, housing, employment, and so on. And the analyst has control over which dimensions to include in an MPI. And then measuring the share of people who are deprived in several of these areas at the same time. And it summarizes their multidimensional poverty levels via a single index. And one of the real strengths of the index is that it can be decomposed. So you can see which specific deprivations are contributing most to the overall score. Whether it's poor health, whether it's education, inadequate housing, and so on. And if you construct an MPI over time, then you can also see how these deprivations and the main drivers have changed over time. So you may find in some years it's health that's been the key driver of multidimensional poverty, but then over time, perhaps the role of health might have being taken over by another dimension like education or housing. And so that's really powerful for policymakers because it can allow them to better target support to those groups who need it most. And just as importantly, it can also help them. It can help policymakers themselves evaluate the impact of their own programs, especially if those programs are in kind. So things like healthcare or education, things that don't have clear outputs, like the case of productivity. And what's also great about the MPI is that can be broken down even further by demographic groups. So you can break it down by age, by geographical region, by time periods, by different demographic groups, whether it be housing tenure groups, people with health conditions and so on. So you can show how those poverty patterns vary across the society. Now we have constructed an example MPI, and this is very much an example, so it's not what we're proposing should be adopted, but just to give you an idea of the sorts of decisions that were made in constructing an MPI and what it could look like. Bridie, can I please trouble you to pull it up? Terrific. So this is just an example MPI that we constructed using the Household Income and Labour Dynamics Survey of Australia, otherwise known as HILDA. And so when constructing the MPI according to the Alkire-Foster method, there are a number of decisions that need to be made along the way. And the first and the hardest of those is which dimensions to include. And in this experimental MPI, we include 5 dimensions. So that's health, employment, education, housing, and social capital. We would have liked to have also included a 6th dimension, which would have been material deprivation. Unfortunately, we didn't get around to it. We did this in 3 months. I think a typical MPI takes about a year to construct. So time wasn't on our side. But for the moment, we've experimented with these 5 dimensions. And then it was a question of which indicators best represented or best proxied for those dimensions. And so we started with a large pool of close to 100 indicators and then gradually narrowed it down to 2 indicators per dimension. And then there is a question of, well, how much importance do we place on each of those dimensions? Do we assign equal weight to health and social capital, or do we perhaps set a higher weight to, say, economic factors over social capital, and so on? And so these are the sorts of decisions we had to make. We developed a number of different versions of the MPI. So we had 5 different versions where we experimented with different weights, different sets of indicators and so on, and eventually landed on an assignment where we just assigned equal weight across the board. So we removed all normative judgment from the list of priorities. And so once we've got the weight, then it's a question of, well, how do we actually identify who is poor? So where do we draw the threshold? And we followed the global MPI, which Sabina Alkire and her team have developed for over 180 countries, I think it is. And so they set the threshold at 33%. So if individuals are deprived in at least 3 of the, say, 10 deprivations, then they're treated as being multidimensionally poor. And you can move that K threshold as you like. And so we also adopted a similar threshold. So we said, well, individuals who are disadvantaged in 4 of the 10 indicators will be assigned as multidimensionally poor. We experimented with a different threshold, a higher threshold of 50%, but also lower thresholds. And so we then did a series of trend analyses and demographic breakdowns to try and understand how multidimensional poverty rate varies from income-based poverty. And the results were really interesting. I won't share them with you today, but they are in a paper published in the Australian Economic Review, if you're interested in having a look.
Thanks, Melek, and great plug there. A gentle reminder to everyone, if you have questions, please use the Q&A box. So Jo and Tamara, if I can turn to you now, we've heard from Melek about what an MPI might be able to do in terms of showing poverty that's more than just income. Would you maybe, Jo first, would you mind sharing from your own experiences or what you've seen in your communities? What are some of the challenges people face that might not be visible if we only measured poverty by income? And in effect, what else is important beyond how much money someone has?
Thanks, Zeah. Income is just one layer. So we mentioned briefly housing is a really big challenge for many people at the moment. And it doesn't matter. People may be on a quite a decent wage, but if a half or three quarters of that income is going towards rent or a mortgage, it doesn't actually leave much left over. So that's probably the number one thing I'm seeing in certainly Seymour. And then it sort of leads on to some health and safety implications where people are living in places that are just not suitable for them, whether it's overcrowding or unsafe environments or things that aren't being maintained. Another issue is access to health. So living regionally, and definitely people that live in remote communities, there's often very long distances to travel, which adds to their financial burden. And that also leads into some time poverty. So if people are having to travel to meet basic health needs, if they are working multiple jobs just to put food on the table, then that also, there are also those hidden challenges that perhaps people in the communities don't see. But one thing I really wanted to bring up is the isolation. So when you're struggling and you don't have the funds and people are asking you to meet up, go out, and you're constantly saying, I can't afford this, I can't afford that, we don't have the funds, people stop asking you. You tell yourself that it's okay to be alone, but it's not okay. It's soul destroying and damaging. And of course, you miss out on opportunities. So whether they're work opportunities, making connections, or just that self-care that everyone needs.
Thanks so much, Jo, for sharing that. Tamara, same question for you.
Yeah, so from my experience, poverty isn't about what's in the bank account. It's pretty much about the things that people don't really see. So it's the difference between paying your rent and being able to do a proper grocery shop. The availability of what you can buy and making sure that it's nutritious. And, I'd love to be buying fancy breads and organic vegetables, but I just can't. But then there's also the embarrassment of when you're standing at the checkout and you're watching the total climb, and you're just hoping that no one's noticing that you're having to take things out of your cart that you just can't afford. I've got two daughters that are both on the spectrum, so their needs are pretty specific. They can change very quickly, which means that I'm always having to sort of adjust and prepare what I'm doing. Whether it's pediatric or therapy appointments, I need to be able to put money aside to cover that. Sometimes it also means, though, that I'm having to delay other important things, whether it's my car needs some work done or even just seeing a doctor for myself. I'm constantly having to juggle my priorities, and my ability to budget is pretty spectacular because of that. My ability to make a dollar stretch has become a magic trick. But as soon as I feel like I'm sort of getting on top of things, something else pops up. One of the hardest parts as well as watching my daughters go through this experience with me and seeing all of their friends being able to do all of these things that I just can't offer them. As they get older, they're starting to see through it, and it's a bit, it's heartbreaking and it's gut-wrenching to see their heartbreak, not just your own. Beyond the financial stress, though, there's also the mental load. So there's guilt and there's shame. You feel like you've somehow failed as an adult or a parent because you can't keep up with what others have. There's this misconception that if you're struggling with your finances, that you must be spending all your money on fancy lattes while the bills are piling up. But it's definitely much more complicated than that. I'm just always, having to get pretty creative with what food I've got to make sure that everybody's going to bed satisfied and not hungry. But, survival isn't about skipping lattes. It's making sure that, the family's fed, the lights are on, there's a roof still over our head. But I'm also living with the fear that I'm hoping that my children aren't, trapped into potentially generational poverty, and that my struggles are going to become theirs. I want them to have all of the opportunities that they can have offered to them and grab onto it and have no limits. I don't want them to experience the world feeling the sting of what we can't afford. Every decision I make is decided by this, because I don't want their futures to be defined by hardship. It isn't about the numbers on the page. It's the life you're forced to live and the choices you're forced to make. And for me, the childhoods of my children that I'm trying to protect. But I will bend, stretch and break along the way if I have to, if it means that they're going to have a much better future. But it also affects your relationship. So like Joe touched on, it's the isolation, it's the no longer being invited, or even in my case, actually actively being told that my friendship was too hard for them, so they couldn't continue with it. It's incredibly isolating in a way that money can't measure that. So like if it's only sort of measured by income, it misses the whole picture. So hopefully, this panel can help change and move forward.
Thank you so much for sharing your story with us, Tamara. There's been a bit of conversation going on in the chat about the importance of lived experience. And so my next question for you is, when researchers are designing national poverty measures, why do you think it's important that people with lived experience are part of the process? And what difference does it make when your voice or the voices of your community are heard in these processes?
If you don't include the people that the system fails, you'll keep designing systems that fail them. Lived experience isn't a bonus, it's a blueprint for real change.
Thanks so much, Tamara. Next, I'm going to turn to you, Nicole. So BSL and the Melbourne Institute have been working on the demonstration MPI for Australia, which Melek has shared some of. Why did we do this work, and what has it told us?
Thanks, Zeah. Let me just first describe myself. So I have longish brown hair parted on the side, and I'm also wearing all black. It seems to be a BSL colour today. And thanks to everyone who's joining us. I can see that we've got quite a number of BSL friends in the chat, and Professor Bieske also shared a link to her article, which is in the same journal that Melek was talking about before. Yes, so as you've heard, BSL's done work along with Melbourne Institute and with Oxford, actually the Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative, to build a demonstration multidimensional poverty index, or MPI, and really to emphasise that word demonstration. We did it just to show what one could look like for Australia, and so that we could really explore and understand the methodology that's used as part of that collective effort. Doing it has taught us a lot. It's given us a really good understanding of what's needed for the work. So Melek's talked to that a bit already, but the initial process of analysis, decisions that need to be made, the data that's used, and as we've just been talking about, the really central importance of including people with lived experience as part of the process, which we did do. And that's been incredibly useful for us when we're then able to talk about what an MPI is and how it can be used. It's been really helpful as well to have this demonstration in our advocacy for official poverty measures, so we can show people what this actually looks like and the kinds of things that it can tell you. So we know from doing it, what it shows is it can give an aggregate score for people who are experiencing multidimensional poverty, but you can also disaggregate or decompose it and see the areas in which people are experiencing poverty and where change is needed. So it's super helpful for policymakers and for those of us working in the sector and the broader community to really be able to understand poverty more effectively. And what it told us, because it is just a demonstration, but what it tells us is that monetary and multidimensional measures really do complement each other. They show different things. They enable a much deeper understanding of the situation and challenges for people living in poverty. And then we've been able, just on the work that we've done and the results that we have, to be able to say it indicates this sort of level of poverty, but it is only a demonstration, it is only indicative. So it's been very helpful in that learning context and in the demonstration context, and really acknowledging all the work that Melek has done to do it, because she really has driven so much of it.
Thanks, Nicole. Melek, I might jump back to you. So from your perspective, what should Australia do in relation to poverty measurement?
I think there's a couple of things that we need to do, and the first of those is really just to adopt an official and consistent way of measuring poverty, as is done in many countries across the world, but especially Canada and New Zealand are really nice comparable examples where poverty measure has been made official and it's actually been embedded in their legislation, which means that governments in those countries are legally required to track progress and to take action to reduce poverty over time. And they're showing that they're actually making real progress in reducing poverty. And I think that can be an inspiration for us, and that we can hopefully do the same if we make those key decisions and arrive at a framework that is mutually agreed on. Second, I think that we need more comprehensive measures of poverty than what we've traditionally used. So as I mentioned earlier, Australia's traditionally used income-based measures, but I think that really falls short of capturing poverty as it's experienced on the ground. And we've heard stories from Joe and Tamara and their experience of poverty. And I think that we really do need a dual approach. So we need to measure both monetary as well as non-monetary aspects to be able to identify those experiences that people are having that are not always monetary. And just to highlight the value of using both measures, I often use the example of two people who are equally poor, but then one is additionally a single mom who is caring full-time for a child with a disability. Now, if we only use an income-based measure, then those two people look like they're equally deprived in the eyes of the system, when the reality is that one is experiencing far deeper and more complex disadvantage. And another example might also be two people who have similar and reasonable income, but then one lives in regional New South Wales and has poor access to public transport, and so they end up spending a part of their income commuting to work. And so that person's resources don't stretch as far as the first person who may live closer to key amenities. And therefore their opportunities are more limited, even though their income looks the same on paper. So a dual approach would be able to identify those hidden layers of hardship and also help policymakers design programs that assist those who most need it. Yeah, I think that's it.
Thanks, Melek. Nicole, if it's okay, I'll jump back to you. So we've heard from Melek about a monetary and an MPI approach and how that can let us see the nuance in poverty and understand the experience of poverty. I want to ask you a little bit about the so what. So what would actually change for services, for budget decisions, and for how we track progress against poverty if government were to adopt both a monetary and a multidimensional measure?
Yeah, so to slightly change a saying, you can't fix what you don't measure is what I would say. And Melek's already talked about the importance of that in different contexts, and that we don't measure poverty. And that makes it difficult for us to address it, really. So official poverty measures will enable us to understand what needs to be done to really address poverty. And we need to make sure then that we get the definitions right, we get the measures right, that we're really grounding it in the experience of people living in poverty so that it's meaningful. And importantly, that the things that are included as the dimensions and indicators are things on which government can take action. So you saw in the demonstration that Melek had up, we've identified in the demonstration model the 5 dimensions, so health, employment, education, housing, social capital. And within those, there are various opportunities for government to take action from a policy perspective, but it requires that decision by government to do so. And it requires a really good understanding of what is needed to be done. And so the MPI actually shows areas where action is most needed and how to make the best use of resources. And certainly in the context of the use of an MPI overseas, it has enabled government to really understand the areas contributing the most to people living in poverty and to their experience. And it's enabled government to prioritise across government and make effective resourcing decisions to target those areas. So what we would certainly hope is that that is what would be able to be possible within Australia. And we would then be able to track that progress year to year and see shifts and changes over time.
Thanks, Nicole. Jo and Tamara, if I could come to you again. We've heard a bit from Nicole about what an adoption of dual measures might mean. I'm really interested to hear from you both about how do we make sure that these tools are about people, not just about numbers? And Jo, we might start with you if that's okay.
Sure, thanks, Zeah. Well, as people in the chat have been discussing, it definitely needs to have people's lived experiences right in the heart, in the centre, when we're designing an MPI, because they need to capture the emotional and psychological and social impacts of poverty. Because as Tamara mentioned, that poverty is also about shame and guilt, isolation, exclusion, and the loss of control and power in your own life. So currently we have measures of how many people in Australia are living in poverty. So a multi-dimensional poverty index would ask, what does poverty feel like and look like? And how can we change that in a way that not only restores income, but also dignity?
Thanks, Jo. Tamara?
Thanks, Zeah. I think we need to make a start by utilising the voices of the people, not just data. It means listening to the stories behind the statistics, involving the people who actually live this reality every day. Because if the only voices shaping these tools are from boardrooms and statistical papers, they'll never truly reflect what life of poverty is really like. When you include the people with lived experience in the process, the numbers suddenly have meaning. They become connected to real lives, real challenges, and hopefully real solutions. That's how we make sure that the tools aren't just about counting problems. They're about understanding people and building something that actually helps them.
Thanks, Tamara. Thanks, Jo. So we've heard a bit now about what it would mean. Nicole, I'd love to jump to you to unpack a little bit about what you might see as the biggest hurdles for adopting an MPI in Australia, whether it's data, definitions, governance, and how we might overcome those.
So, as we've already been talking about, it's completely possible to do. So, as Melek said, we set ourselves a pretty ambitious deadline when we did this work. So it was done in a pretty tight period of time, 3 to 4 months at least, to have a demonstration. It normally takes longer than that based on the experience of Professor Alkaya at Oxford, who's done this around the world. But it doesn't take a very long period of time to do well. So it's entirely possible. What it requires is commitment from government to do it, and engagement across community, including, as we've been talking about, the real centrality of people with lived experience in the process. And it requires then some decisions to be made along the way, including obviously the people who are most impacted by this as a central part of that. The piece that we've done a lot of thinking and work about is data, and what data would be needed or would be best. So the demonstration has been done using a particular data set called HILDA. There are a variety of other data sets that can be used, and HILDA is not an official government data set. So it would ideally be done using official government data. And so really figuring out what data is available to get to the issues that need to be considered as part of a multidimensional poverty index is going to be really important. But it's entirely achievable, and it's entirely doable. It really just requires that commitment and a really good design process to take us along the way so that we can have an MPI and then we can report on it.
Thanks, Nicole. So, Melek, we've been getting a number of technical questions coming through the chat and also the Q&A in relation to the kind of demonstration MPI. So we've got one around how it accounts for whether people are housed or unhoused in terms of the housing dimension. There's also been questions about children and older women. So hoping, I know that's a bit of a catch-all, but I'm hoping you can just give us a little bit of insight into some of those technical questions.
Sure, I'd be happy to. The question around housing and the inclusion of those who are both high housed and unhoused. Unfortunately, we just couldn't look at the homeless population using HILDA simply because of data unavailability. We have been speaking to the ABS about expanding this work using admin data, and there are some ongoing really exciting developments with administrative data, specifically with PLIDA, and hopefully there will soon homelessness data will be embedded in that data lab. I'm not sure that it is at the moment. And also this work currently relies on HILDA, but hopefully with more resources we could expand it to use HILDA and hopefully to include the homes. But the housing dimension was, I think, the one we had the most trouble with. We would have liked to have included details on housing quality, for instance. That wasn't available. And yeah, I mean, it was really tricky, and we had to just do the best we could with the data that we had. I did see a question around breakdown, so whether the results were broken down by different demographic groups and for those experiencing long-term health conditions and so on. And yes, they have been broken down by those groups, and the results are as you would expect. So when we look at the incidence of multidimensional poverty amongst those who have, say, a long-term health condition, their incidence is so much higher than it is for those without a health condition. And the gap between those two groups is growing significantly over time. So it is actually worsening. And we did a comparison across the last 2 decades. We also did breakdowns by First Nation status. And again, those gaps were enormous and growing. And we did breakdowns by housing tenure types. So we looked at those who are in social housing versus private rental, and homeowners, as you would expect, homeowners had the lowest incidence of multidimensional poverty. Social housing tenants had the highest. I think it was about 18% of them experienced multidimensional poverty. And again, those rates were increasing. So we really are seeing worsening levels of poverty, both income but also multidimensional. Again, I mean, these are not conclusive results. It was quickly done, and it's just an example MPI, but yeah, the results are worrying.
Thanks, Melek. Another question that we've received that I might start with you, Nicole, but then open it up to the broader panel is, how well does the wider community understand the nature of poverty in Australia? And do they recognise what poverty means in the Australian context?
I think it's an interesting question, Zeah. I mean, we know, as Melek referred to, the ACOS research that came out earlier this week, which confirms something that the Productivity Commission said last year, was it's about 1 in 7 Australians are living in poverty, and for children it's worse. So that's a pretty significant proportion of the Australian population. And we've heard Joe and Tamara, and we've had the great privilege of having Joe and Tamara speak in numerous places with us doing this work. So I've had the chance to spend a bit of time with both of them, which has been fantastic to really talk about what poverty looks like, and that it isn't just about income. Particularly, I think the component of social capital or social exclusion is something that is important for people to understand, and that is one of the consequences of policy settings and decisions that are being made. So in terms of how much the Australian population understand it, I think a lot of people probably may know someone who's had this kind of experience, but whether they think about it as poverty or not is an interesting question. Definitely, we would think that if we do have official definitions of poverty, we then have a greater shared understanding of what poverty is. And then across the community, we're able to have that discussion much more effectively than we are currently. Because as Melek said at the beginning, when we talk about these measures of poverty that are being put out, we have to then ask what kind of definition people are using. So how are they defining poverty in the way that they're talking about it? So it would very much help, I think, with community and broader understanding if we had official definitions.
Thanks, Nicole. Joe, Tamara, or Melek, anything to add on that question from your perspectives?
I'm sure, yeah. Nicole actually hit the nail on the head, I guess, with people know about poverty. They'll probably know someone living in poverty, but they may only reduce it to income. So people that are out of work or are living rough, they're not actually understanding sort of the broader, like, access to education, access to quality food, and yeah, just things like that. I've lost my train of thought. Sorry, I'll put it on to Tamara or Melek.
Sorry, I think a common misconception is that if you're living in poverty, you must be homeless. The fact that I've got a roof over my head, and I'm clean in appearance, and seem to come across as well-spoken and educated, that I couldn't possibly be someone who is struggling. People are actually quite surprised sometimes when I tell them the real hidden underbelly of things going on for myself.
Thank you, Joe and Tamara. Another question, this one's probably for you, Melek. It's a bit technical. So, is there any evidence in Australia that explores the financial position of people in middle income percentiles and therefore more vulnerable to poverty and other forms of deprivation?
I love that question. I didn't see it. So actually, when we did look at the MPI, we compared it against income-based poverty measures as well. So we wanted to understand what the overlap looked like. And to our surprise, the overlap wasn't all that large when we look at those who fall below the income-based poverty line. But then when I looked a little bit closer at the data and looked at those who were slightly above the poverty line, so it's teetering on the middle income households, most of them appeared to be multidimensionally poor. So 80% of them sort of fell just slightly above the poverty line. So the MPI does allow us to look a little bit more deeply at those individuals who might just fall above the poverty line, but help us understand the sorts of deprivations they experience in other ways. And I also think that, I mean, the way we're measuring poverty at the moment is, or at least the income measures that are typically used include a wealth. And so they might be capturing some of those people who, elderly people who own their homes outright, but who have low income. So they'll be picked up in the income-based measure. And so that's something that I think needs to be talked about and needs to be discussed, whether we make a wealth adjustment when looking at it, when measuring income.
Thanks, Melek. If any of the panelists have anything to add, please do jump in. These questions come through, it's a question but more of a comment. So it's from someone who works in legal aid, and they're commenting that each legal aid commission has a slightly different measure of the means test, which they use, which is one of the factors that helps determine their eligibility to the legal assistance. So what their point is that an official Australian poverty measure would be invaluable in terms of when looking at the means testing settings, so not just state by state, but actually at an Australian level. I know it's a bit of a statement, but I thought I would open that up to reflections from the panel. It's one of the potential many benefits of official poverty measures.
Yes, I think we're all just going to agree. I mean, having that standardised measure across Australia would be tremendously helpful, I think, in a range of different services and systems that operate, because everything is judged so differently and decisions are made on different bases. It can sometimes be really hard to find that out.
So we're coming towards the end of our time today. I would like to welcome the panelists to share any final reflections that they have. Nicole, given you were just speaking, I'm going to hold you to the end, but I might start with you, Melek. Any final reflections?
Yeah, I've been reading a lot of Joseph Stiglitz lately, who's the Nobel Prize-winning economist, and he's got so much wisdom. And I got from him the quote that what we measure shapes what we do, and I really like that. And I think that we now have the data, we have the tools, we have lots of international examples to show how it can be done. And I suppose the only thing that's missing at the moment is the commitment to make it happen. So it'd be really nice to make that final commitment and to see poverty rates go down.
Thank you, Melek. Tamara, any final reflections you'd like to share today?
I think I just want everybody to remember that poverty isn't just about a policy, it's about the people. Behind every number, there's someone out there who's doing it incredibly tough and trying to hold things together. And they're having to make choices that most people don't have to think about. If you can take one thing away from today, it'll be this: include us. Include people with lived experience when you're designing programs, setting measures, making decisions about what support's needed. Because when those voices are a part of the process, the solutions become more real and practical and more human. For me, it's about creating a future where my daughters and others like them don't have to face the same barriers that I've had to. That starts with people in forums like this, choosing to see beyond the numbers and truly listening to the stories behind them.
Thank you so much, Tamara. Jo?
Thanks, Zeah. Yes, sometimes poverty is more about a lack of choices and support than actual income. And sort of continuing on from what Tamara has just said, that behind every person that may be living in poverty, there are feelings. They may be exhausted, or don't know what to do or need support. And I think the kindness and caring is what we need as well.
Thank you. Now, Nicole, I'm going to be a bit cheeky with you, and I'm going to ask you a final question to help frame your reflections. So imagine it's 2030, we're 5 years into the future. If we got this right, what would success look like, both for government decision makers, but most importantly for people and communities experiencing poverty?
So I am very optimistic that within 5 years we will have poverty measures based on lived experience of people using fit for purpose data. We have annual reporting. We have the outputs from those official measures that are embedded into government decision making, and a framework that can be used across government to make policy decisions, so that then we're actually really able to address what we can see from the official measures that we have, and that really is shining a spotlight on the lives of people experiencing poverty. And then we're able to have really direct and reasonably immediate positive impact on people's lives because of the action that government is taking. And I should say it's not only government, it's also the community sector and others who would then be able to use the data and to really act effectively and do what is most needed and most useful. So that is my hope, wish, belief that is possible in the next 5 years.
Thanks, Nicole. I just want to thank all of our fantastic panellists, Jo, Tamara, Melek and Nicole. It's been a privilege to sit here and listen to your insights, your personal experiences and your expertise. I particularly want to thank Jo and Tamara for bringing your personal stories and the experiences from your community to this conversation. We are all the richer for it. I also want to thank everyone who's joined us today, who's engaged in the conversation in the chat, through the questions and answers. It's been a fantastic hour to be able to spend with you all. Finally, I want to thank our Auslan interpreters, Alana and Megan, and captioner Zena for helping to make this session today accessible. BSL is committed to raising the voices of those with lived experience of disadvantage and advocating for better solutions. A recording of today's session will be available on our website in the coming days, and we encourage you to share it with others. Please also subscribe to hear about our next BSL Talks. You can do that by visiting our website, www.bsl.org.au. We will be having one final BSL Talks for this year, and it will be in December, so make sure you keep an eye on your inbox once you register for that. So thank you again for joining us today for this really important conversation where we hope to achieve a poverty-free Australia, and I encourage you all to stay engaged and partner with us, as it's definitely not something any organisation can achieve alone. We can only do that in partnership. So thanks again for joining. I hope you have a fantastic rest of your Wednesday.